We couldn't have a better closer than Andrew Carr today. I got to meet Andrew during his distinguished academic career at Utica University, teaching cybersecurity and forensics. And we talk about how to prevent at the beginning, what we do in the middle, what we do for recovery. But what about the worst case scenario? Andrew was one of my first guests on Health Stealth Radio, which I hope you will tune into at some point, where he talked about the life of a data hostage negotiator. Doesn't get cooler than that. Without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Andrew. Thank you for joining us and look forward to hearing.
Thank you very much, Frank. All right, thank you, everyone. So I'm here to talk to you a bit about if the worst case scenario happens. As Frank mentioned, you guys already talked about prevention, kind of in the interim. Well, this is if everything kind of goes wrong. So if we could advance to the next slide, please. I just want to give you a little background on myself. Frank mentioned my experience at Utica University. I'm a double alum there. I was the director of the graduate cybersecurity programs. I've spent a total of about 13 years teaching as an adjunct or a full-timer. I also spent time as an analyst doing digital forensics for law enforcement for almost a decade. I've spent a number of years in the private sector leading incident response teams as a ransomware negotiator, hundreds of incidents that I've dealt with, multi-million-dollar engagements with the likes of Hive, Akira, Lockbit, Sodinikibi, you name it. And just a little plug here. I was brought in for the forensics on the retrial of Caitlin Conley here locally. That is currently a true crime documentary on Hulu called Little Miss Innocent. So feel free to check that out. Next slide. So we're going to get into a few different things here. I want to give you some insights before we really get into the nitty gritty of a negotiation, how these things go, insights you might need. We'll talk about the primary stakeholders, so those involved. You might just think it's myself and you, but there's a number of different parts and pieces within this. There's some cost relationships too, depending upon the goal of the negotiation and ultimately where you want to shake out. The typical workflow, so you know what to expect. The different approaches to a negotiation, and then some common pitfalls. I want to finish up there because we oftentimes will see an organization, they have their best foot forward. They're really trying to do what's right by the affected individuals. But unfortunately, they get into these kind of mistakes that we see routinely, and it can either hurt them or the individuals that they, unfortunately lost their information out there on the dark web. So to go over some of the stats with you. So these are derived specifically from Booz Allen Hamilton. I'm part of the incident response practice there, specializing in the commercial sector. So just to give you an idea of how impactful this has become. So I was doing ransomware cases back when the average ransom was $1,000 or $10,000. Well, now we're up over $6 million for the average ransom demand. And our largest one received last year was over $100 million. So just to give you a perspective here on how much of a issue this is going forward. But that doesn't mean that's what you're going to pay. As you can see here, we get about an 80% reduction. And this is specific to Booz Allen, but we're not the only game in town. And this is pretty typical across vendors. You'll see a significant reduction. And threat actors know this. So they start real high, hoping that they'll shake out at their ultimate kind of, what they want to walk away with. But the important piece there is that last statistic right at the bottom. 70% of the ransomware cases we get involved in have data exfiltration. So that's that double extortion model whereby not only are they trying to encrypt your files, but they're also taking data before they do so, so that if the encryption doesn't take hold or you have quality backups, they can then extort you based on this damaging information, whether it be company financials or PHI or whatever it might be. They're using that to try and get you to the bargaining table to get you to pay them to suppress that information. So ultimately your patients or customers aren't aware of exactly what was taken during the course of that infiltration. Many of the groups are kind of typical players, things like Akira, Lockbit. Those are kind of the heavy hitters in the area. And especially in the healthcare arena, you're going to see black suit, Black Cat, Akira, Play ransomware. Those are the ones that really target the healthcare sector and manufacturing sectors because they know that they are so ripe for the picking, if you will, because they can't be down for very long. And next slide, please. So I wanted to also give you some perspective here on how ransomware works now. This isn't the days in the early time where it was just some guy in a basement kind of cobbling all this together. These are organized, structured organizations, and they work in a very specific way. So you'll find that at the top is the leadership. So let's take Akira, for example. You have a group of individuals that create the ransomware itself. They then distribute that ransomware to affiliates that perform a buy-in. So they will pay money up front to gain access to the software, the malware, even a playbook of how to infiltrate these organizations. And from there, they'll go down to the initial access brokers. So these are hackers for hire. Essentially, they're out there breaking into organizations, and then they're going on the dark web and they're selling this information to the highest bidder. Oftentimes, the highest bidder is, in fact, a ransomware gang. They are now able to purchase zero-day exploits that would have been the realm of nation states just a few years ago. So this is quite an organized structure, and even some of these groups have their own HR departments, their own code creation groups. So it's very much a organized and structured business unit now, as opposed to the early days where it was really just kind of those one-off, two-off hackers kind of coming together. Next slide, please. Next one. So I want to get into the actual communications if I could. So in here, we're going to have a number of different pieces, a number of different groups that are part of this kind of workflow, if you will. You're going to have the victim organization. That's the person that gets hacked and receives the actual ransomware encryption. You're going to have outside counsel, hopefully. And I stress this because many might think that their internal counsel is sufficient for the purposes of handling an incident like this. But you need to remember that even if it's your internal counsel, that may not provide you the privilege to kind of cloak all of the activities in the forensic examination and investigation to keep outsiders from, information requests or subpoenas or whatever it might be. So you're going to want to bring in that outside privacy counsel, and they'll have a tripartite agreement with a vendor like myself, whereby they will, they'll take all of our investigation findings, all of our communications, and they'll cloak that in privilege so that you're not kind of disseminating that information to the outside world of all the nuts and bolts of what occurred inside. You'll also have your cyber insurance carrier, hopefully. If you don't have cyber insurance, I would suggest it. They are very helpful in navigating these situations. They have what are known as panels of approved vendors that they have vetted for certain services. And they can provide you with the best and brightest when it comes to responding to this type of scenario. So you have everything from payment brokers to forensic investigators to ransom negotiators and everything in between. So this is going to allow you to not only cherry pick from the best vendors out there. They'll also have the law firms on their panel as well. So they know those who day in and day out work hundreds of these cases and know exactly how the notification obligations go, whether it be interstate or international. So this is going to be your best friend. And sometimes they might get really involved in the negotiations themselves. Now, ultimately, they are the ones that are responsible for paying the ransom. So they might want to say in how that goes. Sometimes they'll be looking to reduce the overall payment to stay within coverage limits. Sometimes they are looking to just guide the conversation so that the monetary offers are within reason. Certainly understand that. But it varies from carrier to carrier. And you may see that they kind of defer to, the ransomware negotiator or counsel themselves to kind of hash out that strategy. Next slide, please. So you will also have, the vendor, in this case, Booz Allen Hamilton. They're the ones that are going to negotiate on your behalf. I'm going to reach out to the actual threat actor. We'll initiate a communication, whether that be on a Tor site or email or Tox communication or Telegram or whatever it might be. And we will handle those communications on your behalf. This is for a number of reasons. One of which is not only are you going to be stressed and hyper aware, you're likely going to be really upset. This allows for that insulation between yourselves and the threat actor to keep everything, I like to call it cordial. Frank and I talked on that podcast, and it was kind of this kind of alarming thing where most of our interactions are actually quite polite. We'll say, please, thank you. They will as well sometimes. They view this as a business transaction. They don't view it as, them doing something bad. They think, well, you're a business, you have insurance, we're just capitalizing on that model. So much of this is done in a, like I said, cordial manner, but you do sometimes get groups that are a bit abrasive. And I'll talk a little bit later, but sometimes we have to mirror that tone in order to secure the best outcome, because they only respect that type of kind of forceful attitude, if you will. You'll also have law enforcement. Now, law enforcement isn't always involved, but they can provide valuable insight to your organization. So sometimes they have ongoing investigations into groups, and they have proprietary threat intelligence that they can provide. Additionally, sometimes they're actually hacking back, and they are breaking into the servers and infrastructure of these different groups. And occasionally, they'll be able to collect the decryption keys of a particular group, and they'll be able to hoard those off to the side. And if you contact them, they might be able to get those things back for you. It is rare. It's not, a typical occurrence, but it's absolutely worth checking. Additionally, they will help you in filing that IC3 report so that you have all your ducks in a row. And they may actually request information from us, the vendor, to help them continue their investigations into these groups. So I've had the FBI reach out before and request actual malware, hash values of files, different scripts and usernames and things and the like. I think back to a Hive case that I negotiated where I got access to the data repository of the threat actor. And it was under a really unique username. And I went looking and I found information on him out on a dark web server called XSS. And I provided all that information to them. And so they use all that stuff to find leverage points for these groups and little mistakes and hiccups that the members make to hopefully gain access to that stuff and shut them down. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a bit about cost relationships, because I completely understand that in these circumstances, at the end of the day, every decision made is a business decision. Whether it be a business decision from, keeping things up and running in the near term, whether it be for public relations and the impact that it might have on the longer term and your customer base going forward. But there's typically a direct relationship between the size of the settlement and the length of time the negotiation takes place. So the longer you can get the negotiation to go on, that typically results in a smaller ransom. It's for a number of reasons, but mostly because the threat actor understands that your organization is not crippled by their attack. Now, they might have really damaging information related to your patients or your customers, and that certainly is something to think about. But they know that the initial encryption is going to be the most damaging to your operations. And if you're out 2, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 months, they know that the encryption didn't really take hold, and that first strike wasn't as effective as they thought. So from there, they may actually leverage some harassment campaigns. We know of certain groups that will perform denial of service attacks. So if the encryption didn't work, they'll try to take down your outside communication with the world. If this was an e-commerce company, obviously that has a huge impact. But even for healthcare, your ability to retrieve patient records from an offsite repository can be impacted by that. They will do harassment campaigns. They'll contact patients. They'll contact the news. They might even publish some of the data preemptively in order to prove to you the type of data that they have and how much it would be damaging to the organization. Oftentimes when they do that, media organizations will pick that up and run with it. And then that puts additional pressure on the organization to come to the bargaining table. Those protracted negotiations, though, if we can get them to take hold, those will allow us to bring that ransom down quite significantly. I had on one of my earlier slides, the typical reduction is about 80%. So, you know, it depends on what the starting point is, but it can bring it down to more palatable numbers in the end. Additionally, the inverse of that equation is true. So the faster we go and try to negotiate this out maybe in a few days, you're likely going to be spending a bit more when it comes to that ransom, typically because a threat actor has the upper hand. I was interviewed a while back about some of the unique points of ransom negotiations. And one of the things people don't realize is you've already lost. When we come to the table here, this isn't like a merger and acquisition negotiation where both parties come to the table amicably trying to find that middle ground, right? In this instance, you've already been hit over the head with the bat. And now we're just trying to claw back as much as we can on your behalf to make the pain less. So it's a very unique situation to be in. And it's something whereby you need that additional insight and intelligence that you get from, somebody like myself that's done, scores and scores of these, rather than trying to just, this is the first time you've ever experienced it and going out and trying to work through that. Some of these groups are really unique in the way that they conduct negotiations. Some really like to get paid quickly, and they're willing to take those larger cuts from the ransom. So it all depends, but that's where that intelligence really comes in. And then you have to think about business interruption costs. I've talked pretty much the entire time here about the ransom itself, but you have to factor in how much your downtime is going to impact your organization, how much that's going to impact you in the short term from lack of productivity, lack of ability to perform your daily duties, but also from a kind of ongoing customer base perspective. The longer you're down, the more damage your reputation is going to take. And that may have an impact on future revenue. So obviously that's a business decision. You'll have to kind of weigh the pros and cons of that. But obviously the healthcare sector, manufacturing sector are two of the ones that have the least maximum tolerable downtime and often have to move very quickly to get back up and running. And then you have to think of the health and human safety risks. The first instance of ransomware taking a life was out in a hospital in Germany, where they took down the hospital and an individual had to be transported and unfortunately didn't make it to the next hospital. So it can have real tangible impacts on the lives of your patients and the people you care for. Next slide, please. So what does the workflow look like? Well, first off, we have to come up with a strategy. This is going to be based on that business assessment I just mentioned. Do you want to get back up and running as quickly as possible? Are your backups viable? Are they viable, but they're going to take a significant amount of time to restore down to your systems? Do you need a decryptor? Do you need to suppress really damaging information? These are all factors that we weigh during this initial discussion to figure out what that overall process is going to look like. Sometimes we don't need to pay them at all. We're just trying to get information to show, yes, they did in fact steal information from you, what that information is, and if we can glean any intelligence related to how they got into your systems. Obviously, a forensic investigation is going to provide significant information related to that, but that really depends on the quality of data that's available to the team. So sometimes your notification that information was stolen might happen days or later. And sometimes logs will have rolled over. Maybe you're only keeping track of 24 hours or 48 hours of a certain type of log. And unfortunately, those are gone. So we might not always have everything we need to figure that first ingress method out. So this can help us glean some of that. It can also help us understand the full universe of information that is open to those notification obligations and the types of information. Oftentimes during the negotiation process, we'll try to get file listings of what that information is so that we can truly narrow down that universe to only the people affected. Once we get that strategy, we'll reach out to the threat actor. There's a number of different ways we can do that, but sometimes it's Tor site, especially with the more kind of established groups. They use the dark web very often, but sometimes we'll use Telegram or some other type of communication methodology like that. We will ask them for proof of a number of things, i.e., proof that they can decrypt your files, proof that they stole your information. And if they're leveraging any of those secondary kind of threat tactics like a denial of service or calling the news or whatever it might be, we'll ask that they cease those during the negotiation process on good faith. We will then monitor the chat sites and the leak sites to ensure that the negotiation is progressing appropriately. We'll keep those conversations going and to make sure that there's nothing being posted about the organization. Sometimes I will have, what is called a sobering up post. That's what I like to call them, whereby if the negotiations aren't going the way the threat actor prefers, they might take a snippet of the information that they stole and they'll throw it out there on the dark web for everyone to see. They do this to essentially say to you, we're done screwing around, get back here and get serious, or you're going to have a problem. Oftentimes we can avoid that, but occasionally, depending upon the circumstances, we unfortunately have to kind of eat that to get to our ultimate goal, which might be to delay, to gain the organization more time to shore up its defenses. And sometimes we know it's coming, depending upon the group, and we just have to do our best to get that taken back down or minimize the types of information that would be put up. Additionally, we have to set the tone. This is where, we're going to take the persona of someone in middle management. We won't obviously name names, but we're never a decision maker. This allows us the ability to delay, to seek the approval of higher ups, but to have just enough authority that we can say, yeah, that's not going to happen. My boss isn't going to go for that. We never identify ourselves as a negotiator unless we truly have to. Many of these organizations have a distaste for negotiators, and so that will set the tone in a very negative way if we identify ourselves right out of the gate. Next slide, please. So we want to understand what their motivations are. The vast majority of these, they are working towards a financial goal. There are some groups, though, that are nation state supported, and they may attack, a healthcare institution or critical infrastructure for the purposes of damaging the United States, right? So a national security risk. We've seen some of this with like the Colonial Pipeline hack and others, whereby they are exerting this pressure on something that our nation depends upon in our daily lives. And they're doing it less for that financial motivation and more to cause pain to the United States. We will use our intelligence and prior negotiations to know when we have to push back on these groups. So I started in the beginning, we want to try and approach this cordially, politely. You catch more flies with honey. But in certain circumstances, we have to exert a bit of will. We have to show them that we won't be pushed around. Otherwise, they'll just run rampant on you and they'll try to exert as much pressure on you as they can. They'll follow up very quickly. They'll ask for answers very quickly, and they'll start throwing kind of ultimatums at you. Oftentimes, we found that if you push back and forcefully, but still cordially, let them know that you won't be pushed around and that they're out of line, we do oftentimes get a bit of respect from them. We will obviously, and any vendor will obviously provide you updates throughout this process. You'll see actual copies of the interactions through the chat site. And then ultimately you can make a decision at a certain point of whether or not you're going to settle with this threat actor. You don't have to. Only 23% of our negotiations end up in a settlement because oftentimes we're trying to gain that intelligence and understanding related to notifications, and we're not ultimately in need of a decryptor many times. If we do pay, you'll end out with a number of deliverables. Obviously, one is a decryptor if you need it. Then you'll be looking at proof of deletion and suppression of that data if they took anything valuable. Indication of how they got into your organization. Sometimes that's phishing, sometimes it's remote desktop protocol, sometimes it's just brute forcing passwords. Really depends on the situation. A promise from them that they won't, name you on their leak site. And then obviously if they're doing any of those kind of alternate extortion mechanisms, we ask them to stop those in good faith. Next slide, please. So how do you approach a negotiation from a kind of a psychology perspective? Well, obviously we want to gather that intelligence. We, like I said, kind of take on this persona of middle management. We interact with the threat actor beyond just the negotiations for monetary amounts. We'll try to glean information from them. We'll try to ingratiate ourselves with them by talking up their tool set, asking them questions. You have to think, these are a lot of, kind of IT nerds out there, right? And I can say nerd because I am one myself. But they're enthralled with this product they've created, or they're involved in. And they like to receive praise related to it. So sometimes if you kind of give them a little bit of praise, you ask questions about it, they're more inclined to take a more amicable approach with you, just have a conversation with you. And sometimes you can get a little bit of a grace from them that you can use later on in the negotiations if things start to turn sour. And if they turn sour, sometimes we have to mirror that tone. We have to establish ourselves a little bit more forcefully. It's pretty rare that you'll get a hyper aggressive group, but we know them when we see them, and they're pretty well established. And you go into it knowing what's coming, and you don't take it personally, and you just establish, hey, we're not going to be pushed around, and if you want this to move forward, you're going to treat us with a bit of respect. Next slide, please. So what are the pitfalls? So I've talked about how it should go, right? That's not always how it goes. Unfortunately, a lot of people will try to handle these internally. That can seem like the smart play because you best know your organization, you understand how much this is going to impact you, but you're dealing with a hostile person that just came in and threw a grenade in your infrastructure and in your business. And it's very difficult to maintain that cordial environment, to maintain that business interaction, if you will, after something like that has happened, especially if the negotiations aren't progressing well, and things are going poorly, and then next thing you know, your name's up on their leak site. Things can get heightened and kind of aggressive very quickly. So it's best to have someone in there on your behalf. Additionally, vendors that do this on a daily basis, we amass threat intelligence on these groups. So not only are we keeping records of every negotiation we're involved in, but we also get records from every forensic investigation we're involved in that maybe doesn't have negotiations. We're also scouring the dark web for intelligence related to the individuals in these groups, how they're interacting, what's up for sale, if they're threatening to sell this kind of information off to the side. So you're going to glean a lot more insight by bringing in someone who specializes in this rather than handling it yourselves. Additionally, inexperienced vendors or an internal employee in IT that kind of knows his stuff, that can also create an issue. So I also am an expert witness and have had to work on a couple of botched negotiations. And unfortunately, when I worked in the spring, there was a pretty well-known vendor, but it seemed like maybe the negotiator was a bit new. So they went through the whole process, they paid the ransom, and unfortunately, the negotiator didn't realize that they needed two versions of a decryptor, one for their Windows systems and one for their Linux systems. So once they received the decryptor, they didn't realize that it was only capable of decrypting the Windows systems. By the time everyone realized what was wrong and that it didn't work on all of these other systems that housed all of their virtualized server infrastructure, it was too late. There was no one on the other side of that line. So they paid about $1 million and they could only get back workstations and things like that. So the things that really mattered to them, unfortunately, they had no way of getting back because they had paid and the threat actor was in the wind because this person just didn't realize what they needed at the end of this negotiation. Also, over communicating with your customers. So obviously, you don't want to leave everybody in the dark. You don't want to go completely silent, but there's a balance there. Letting people know that you're investigating these things, that there was an incident and you're looking to the cause, that's totally okay. But letting them know all the ugly details of everything that's going on can really cause you more headaches than you'd prefer. Sometimes in these forensic investigations, things are fluid. We'll find information that sometimes maybe is contradicted by later information, right? When we get a better view of everything. So you may have to walk back certain comments if you're providing too much information right up front. And I haven't touched on it up until now, but the sanctions compliance requirements are quite strict related to this. So the OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Control, they are really serious about this. If you are going to make a payment to a threat actor, you want to ensure that you're not running afoul of any sanctions or anyone on the SDN list. So you would need to look at everything from the indicators of compromise that were gleaned from the investigation to the Bitcoin wallet or Monero wallet, whatever it is. You would want to look at if that's transacted with any known sanctioned wallets, any known sanctioned exchanges. So you're going to need specialized software to rip through all of that, right? And you're going to need this threat intelligence to understand if these tactics, techniques, and procedures are common to another group that is in fact sanctioned. Many of these groups will rebrand the underlying threat actors in that ransomware as a service model will move from group to group. So you want to make sure you're not sending $10 million over to Iran, North Korea, China. So you want to make sure you're doing your due diligence there to ensure you're not dismissing those compliance requirements. And then not communicating with a threat actor is actually quite a detriment to the organization. Even if we're not intending to settle or pay the threat actor, the insight gained from communicating with them can be invaluable. We can understand the true nature of the data stolen. We can get better insight into the method they used to gain ingress into your environment. The intelligence that your organization gains here can help set you up for the future to avoid this again. Only 23% of our matters end up in an actual settlement, so there's no harm in engaging them. Additionally, if they are leveraging some of those secondary extortion tactics like a DDoS attack or those threat campaigns, that communication and them thinking we're coming to the bargaining table can actually stop those from occurring, at least long enough for you to set up secondary mechanisms to prevent them. So all in all, this is something that you'll want to seek outside help. You'll want to seek insight from someone that this is their day-to-day job. And if you're heading to the Vive conference, I will have colleagues there that can talk about everything from this to resiliency with you. So feel free to stop by their booth. But ultimately, you'll want to seek advice, and that advice will come from the vendors, either the law firms or the other vendors that your insurance provider will have pre-vetted for you, so you can be assured you're getting the best of the best. Next slide. I want to thank you all for your time today, and I hope you found this valuable.
This was fantastic, and you landed right on time. Appreciate it. I just have one question. It's going to take, if you could just do it in a short phrase, how would you characterize your relationship with the FBI going back to our first keynote today?
Yeah, the FBI, we have a great relationship. They're really involved, and they've really taken efforts lately to take these groups down directly. We're always happy to help, always happy to provide information to them that we can, because they have the ability to take the fight back to them. So always happy to assist them in any way that we can.